In the case of nuclear or radiological fallout, people living around potential targets such as military bases and chemical plants may be advised to evacuate.
Viewers, we disappeared for a moment there, but we're back. This is the Sublation Magazine show. I'm Douglas Lane. I'm the co-host of Sublation Magazine. I am the author of such short stories as A Sea Monkey Conspiracy and in the short story collection Fall into Time, where you can find Noam Chomsky in the Time Box. I'm also the head honcho here at Sublation Media. With me, as always, is Benjamin Studebaker. Benjamin?
Noam Chomsky in the Time Box is really great. It's me, Benjamin Studebaker, author of 2 books, The Chronic Crisis of American Democracy, The Way is Shut, and Legitimacy in Liberal Democracies.
All right. So I've been put into a time warp. I've been stuck in my family home for coming up on 2 months. I've been driving around my my old town, the town I grew up in, listening to 80s music on my father's satellite radio. And I've been lost. So I haven't kept up with the news. I don't even know what year it is. So you're going to have to catch me up, Benjamin. What is going on in the world? Why is the government shut down? To start
Does
there.
that mean you've been over there for longer than the shutdown? When you first came out there, had it started yet?
I don't think so. It was September 19th when I arrived in Colorado Springs. And
wow.
Mm-hmm.
So the shutdown is ending.
Okay, good.
Yeah.
I guess
8 Democratic senators are going to defect, have defected, and the shutdown is coming to an end. All 8 senators who defected do not have a re-election campaign to run for 2026. They are either retiring in 2026 or they don't anticipate having to run until 2028 or 2030.
Okay,
by which point all of this will be rear-viewed.
Yeah, can I ask you a question on that? Because that's counterintuitive to me. Because it would seem to me that you would defect when you felt enough pressure electorally that like when the shutdown was doing enough damage to your re-election chances
that is not why they defected. They did not defect because they were politically losing from the shutdown.
Okay.
In fact, their argument is that they won all of these races in the off-year election earlier this month, in part because they had committed to the shutdown. That was the argument from those who opposed it, who said they're politically gaining. And if you looked at polling, marginally more people were blaming Trump and the Republicans for the shutdown than the Democrats. So the polling seemed to favor continuing with the shutdown. But the big problem is that you have the federal workers who are getting furloughed. They get their health care from the federal program for federal workers. They're not on Obamacare. The central demand that the Democrats were making was for ACA recipients to retain their subsidies.
Mm-hmm.
So the federal workers very quickly got to a point where they were not on board with this because they have absolutely nothing to gain from the shutdown, since the only demand that the Democrats made was about ACA recipients. So the federal workers, their representatives, very quickly reached a stage of saying, we'd just like to get this done and over with now, please. And meanwhile, the ACA focus meant that the Medicaid people who were being subjected to a work requirement, they weren't really put at the center of this either. So one of the things that you notice is division in terms of healthcare. The fact that the healthcare system has all of these different types of programs that divide the workers into different population chunks with regard to healthcare makes it difficult to coordinate the workers or generate solidarity behind a particular strategy about ACA benefits. Another thing that you notice is that the Republicans were not able to end the shutdown on the basis of, say, ending the filibuster. They didn't have the votes to do that. So Donald Trump was trying to get the Republicans to end the shutdown by ending the filibuster. The Republicans would not cooperate with him on that. And then conversely, in the Democratic Party leadership, Schumer, remained committed to sticking with the shutdown, but could not keep the 8 Democrats from defecting. And I think these 8 Democrats defected not because they thought there was something politically to gain in terms of reelection, but because they were not happy about dysfunctionality of the bureaucracy. Mm-hmm. They were hearing it from the civil servants who they're in regular contact with, that this is really inconvenient for them, and they really don't like it. And I think also there was this debate about the SNAP benefits, which seemed likely to produce a chaotic situation. Mm-hmm. The SNAP benefits were not going to be paid out by the Republicans. There were legal challenges to try to make the Republicans pay the SNAP benefits out of the emergency fund, which the Department of Agriculture has to fund food programs in emergency situations. The administration challenged this on the grounds that there's no natural disaster. It's a government shutdown, which is a political event, not an act of God. Mm-hmm. The response is that because the food stamp program covers specifically low-income people who not only have low income, but also low assets, they have no financial cushion. So as soon as the program is disrupted, roughly 40 million people are plunged into a state of significant food insecurity, which would constitute an emergency. Mm-hmm. That argument was persuasive for 2 different federal judges, but the administration appealed the decision, and the Supreme Court stayed some of the activity. Specifically, there were cases where the amount of money that was in the emergency fund was roughly $5 billion, but the cost of the food stamps for the month was roughly $8 billion. So it wasn't enough to pay the full program. And then some states were trying to top it up so that the full benefits would be paid out. The Trump administration said the states aren't authorized to top up the program. Full benefits would go beyond what was in the emergency fund. So there was litigation going on with regard to the food stamps and questions about whether food stamps would be paid out. There was also the possibility that some food stamp benefits that were paid out illegally and would have to be potentially clawed back, or that there would be an attempt to claw them back. All of this created a food insecurity question affecting roughly 40 million people. And in particular, a lot of food stamp recipients work at grocery stores, especially Walmart. Mm-hmm. So there's also a lot of overlap between the people who run the grocery stores and the people who would be put into a position of food insecurity by a lapse in the food stamp benefit. So a high likelihood of substantial crime if this went on for any great length of time. So I think the 8 Democrats defected because of concerns that they had about public order and about the bureaucrats, and the bureaucrats getting paid and the bureaucracy being able to function is a question of fundamental order. But what the shutdown, I think, really reveals is major divisions at multiple different levels. The Democrats unable to be coordinated in their commitment to shutting down. The Republicans unable to coordinate a commitment to ending the filibuster. So the Republicans in Congress not being sufficiently deferential to the president to do that simply because he repeatedly demands it. And then also the fact that healthcare became the central issue, but only at the level of the ACA subsidies, meant that there was not even commitment. And so you've got a situation where the food stamp recipients, who are also in many cases Medicaid recipients, they're not feeling particularly committed to this because the Democrats have been centering ACA, not Medicaid. And then you've also got the federal workers who aren't committed to it because they have their own healthcare programs. So just loads of division all over the place and myriad coordination problems. But nonetheless, this produces eventually an end. But we didn't get to an end because somebody was able to straightforwardly coordinate what they wanted out of this. We got to the end of the shutdown because of failures of coordination, which produced funding the government as the alternative.
Why did Trump think it was, why did the Republicans, I guess, think it was to their advantage to create chaos around the SNAP benefit program?
So I think that they thought that if they created chaos around the SNAP benefit program, that this would produce a public order question, which would produce demands behind scenes, that the shutdown be ended quickly so that there would not be uncertainty regarding the functioning of the food system and regarding the business environment for the grocery stores.
Mm-hmm. So this was not an appeal to the voters. It wasn't a matter of changing the political will of the people, but rather moving the bureaucracy, moving the political class because of threats to public order that would be difficult for various sectors within various public officials of all types. Is that right?
Yeah. And I think when it seemed like the judicial system was going to make sure that the SNAP benefits got funded anyway, there was a sense of additional time. But when that became hairier and SCOTUS put a stay on the ruling allowing for on the idea that there could be full funding for the food stamp program, this created more uncertainty about the food situation. And I think not every Democrat was principally concerned about that. Some Democrats were more concerned about re-election or about the midterms or about the electoral gains that they had made earlier in the month. But others had a principal worry about public order issues. And if you had gotten to the stage of a public order issue, then there would be all kinds of questions about how the public order issue would play. Because if you were getting food-motivated criminal activity, would that be blamed on the Republicans for having cut the food stamp benefits, or would it be blamed on the Democrats for the reason that in general the Democrats tend to get the blame for crime and violence? Hard to say. And then, beyond that political question, there's also, the simple behind the scenes lobbying question of, is this something that anybody in the business world wants to see? Do they want to see a crime wave driven by food insecurity, which will affect not just the grocery stores, but will spill out? It will produce norms of criminal activity that will affect lots and lots of brick and mortar stores in lots of places potentially. So I think that in combination with the fact that the federal workers were themselves continuously complaining to the Democrats all the time about the shutdown because they had nothing to gain from it.
Okay, so I guess what's most interesting to me about this scenario is how it kind of is the reverse of what had happened earlier when Trump paused all funding of the executive bureaucracy, because at that point, it was really the Democrats and the bureaucracy itself that interpreted the pause in funding in a way that would put need-based programs at risk. And then the Republicans had to scramble to try to undo some of the policy decisions and interpretations that have been put forward by the executive bureaucrats and the Democrats. And so now, and at that moment, the Democrats felt that creating chaos and human suffering would be to their political advantage. Today, it was the Trump administration that moved in that direction to create food insecurity for political purposes.
So what specifically are you referring to here?
There are a number of examples, but the primary one that comes to mind is the USAID medical benefits that were going to other nations, primarily to Africa. The one that would be brought up as a talking point is around.
Right. That doesn't produce an internal disorder problem in the United States.
No, but it creates an international disorder problem and international human suffering. And the human suffering is what is going to be the driver.
It's the political order problem that is the driver. It's not the human suffering.
That's
the fact that the human suffering
is the driver. It's the fact that the human suffering creating disorder. But
if it didn't without the disorder, nobody would care politically.
But politically,
apart from the fact that people might vote differently on the basis that they're upset,
right?
But people in Africa can't vote.
Oh, I understand that, but I'm just saying that nonetheless, that even is more interesting because the Trump administration did move to try to secure funding for these international aid programs as to protect themselves politically after they paused the funding. But because they felt it was liability for them to have that human suffering on their
I'm not
sheet.
sure that that's the case. I think that they thought that those programs were genuinely beneficial programs in many cases. I think that they decided in a kind of blanket way to get rid of U.S. aid, and then they wanted to look at, well, what actually do we want to keep here? And they did this in many cases during the Doge thing, where they would announce the big sweeping thing, and then they would go, well, actually, there's lots of particular things underneath that heading that we still want.
The other example would be like the VA hospitals and other and Medicaid programs and Medicare programs where I think, but certainly Medicaid programs where in the United States, people's access to healthcare was seemingly threatened by the pause in federal funding. And also, there were layoffs or at least pauses in employment that came along with that as well. And they had to go out of their way to make sure that people were actually directly helping the public, were not let go or paused or had their jobs seemingly in jeopardy. So it was, there were two examples. There were like multiple examples around the pause of federal funding where a disorder was created either internationally, which is not as important, or nationally, where Trump was blamed for being vindictive, psychotic, purposely.
It's not really about blame, right? That's not the focus. It's about the disorder and the disagreement being the thing that is driving the activity rather than coordinated.
It matters who's blamed for the disorder. It does. It matters whose mess it is, who has to clean it up, and it matters politically who is blamed. In the
we have polling data about who's currently being blamed. We can, we're just talking about politically what are the effects in terms of how are people responding. But the substance of my intervention is not to talk about who's at fault. I'm not making a normative adjudication.
I think it's worthwhile to note that who's at fault shifts from one moment to another around the similar decisions around funding. That when it came to pausing the funding for federal employees and federal programs, Trump felt it was a liability to be seen causing medical insecurity around access to medicine. And in this instance, he felt it was to his political advantage to be seen.
Those cuts were permanent cuts. Those were not based on a shutdown. So, this is a temporary situation.
I actually
think
think
time is very different. Political time plays a very different role in a shutdown.
At the beginning, there was a pause in federal funding, and it was unclear as to what would be permanent, what would not, and who was affected and who would not be.
Right, but the purpose of Doge was to eventually agree on permanent cuts that could then be put into the big omnibus bill. So the aim there was to find cuts that would be long-term savings for the state.
Sure, but I'm not talking about
budget fight.
I'm not talking about the long-term aims of Doge. I'm talking about the way in which Trump and Elon decided to just pause everything so they could assess and what the immediate political effects of that were, and how Trump and Elon had to scramble to make sure that programs that were seen to be in the public interest, or in the interest of humanitarian aid, were not decimated by the pause. Then later on, cuts that they really wanted to go through became a political battle around Medicaid, for instance. But I'm just saying that it is worth noting. I'm not making a big political point here. I'm just wanting to point out that in both cases, both parties are willing to create disorder and are willing to create human suffering for political purposes.
Well, of course, that goes without saying.
Yeah, right. I just think it doesn't go without saying, unfortunately.
It should go without saying.
Yeah, but it doesn't. because for most people on the left, the assumption is the so-called right is going to be more willing to inflict harm on the public to get its political its political aims accomplished, whereas the Democrats are the nicer party and wouldn't do that. So I just want to point out that what's interesting to me is, in one instance, Trump was willing to be seen as kind of vindictive, inhuman, psychotic around SNAP benefits, right? Like just purposely trying to take away benefits that many people need for political purposes. And he was willing to be seen doing that because it was to his political advantage to do so. And I think that's worth noting.
Yeah. Certainly it's the case that both parties will look at the situation and see if they can obtain an advantage. And it's not as if there's some set of things that are off the table necessarily in either case. It depends on what the situation is and what each side and the different factions within each side think they can gain from different configurations. The Democrats didn't make any kind of stink about the healthcare stuff when this was initially going through as part of the big omnibus bill. At that point, they said, well, there's nothing we can do about it. And so not only did they admit that they couldn't block it in terms of voting numbers, they also didn't really try to go to the public with any of it, and then waited until this stage where they could try to raise the specter of the imminent cuts as a basis for doing the shutdown, and then chose to focus principally on the ACA cuts and not on the Medicaid stuff, which means kind of tacitly the Democrats have been okay from the very beginning with the Medicaid work requirements, because the Democrats and the Republicans share a view now, that the labor force participation rate needs to be marginally increased. And this is true even for the ostensibly left wing of the Democratic Party. At this stage, like the Mamdani thing, all of the signature Mamdani policies are about facilitating a raise in the labor force participation rate. They're not about trying to generate socialist possibility.
Well,
what's
of course.
The point of free buses? Make it easier for people to get to work. What's the point of rent-controlled housing? Make it so that people who are low income, that they can be in housing without getting a wage increase, so as to prevent the employer from having to raise wages. What's the purpose of childcare? The purpose of childcare is to allow people to work longer hours, and subsidizing the childcare means that you don't have to pay them more while you get more work out of them. This suite of stuff, all of it aims at facilitating getting people to go back to work after the pandemic. And it's all in response to the labor shortage narrative. Because what happened during the Biden administration? The workers at the bottom end of the wage ladder saw wage increases because it was difficult to get people who were receiving pandemic benefits to return to retail and food service jobs that pay terribly, have awful conditions, involve being treated badly all day long by both customers and managers. People, for very understandable and I think perfectly reasonable reasons, did not want to go back to those kinds of jobs. And so the employers were having to raise wages in response. Now, the Biden administration initially made it out like this was a great achievement of it to have raised wages for workers at the bottom end of the wage pool. Mm-hmm. But in practice, the behavior of both parties since this point has been to try to get these people to go back to work. And that meant no student debt relief, because student debt relief gives you more choices about whether you enter the labor force after you complete your degree. It meant no Medicaid unless you are working or you can prove that you're disabled or medically frail. And anybody who says that the Democrats should be opposed to this, they'll say that they're opposed to it. But in point of fact, they won't center any of these issues. They won't talk up any of these issues. And whenever they do attempt to defend any section, it will always be people who are in the labor force. It won't be the people who are on the line about whether they will or won't work.
Do you think it's easier to organize people who are in the labor force and have a job than it is to organize people who have are relying on benefits or other government programs to subsidize them?
Depends on the situation.
Mm-hmm.
Historically, it was easier to organize people who are in work.
Mm-hmm.
but that's less obviously true now than it used to be.
What do you think has changed to make that less obvious today?
So, for one, there's a greater differentiation in the kinds of work that people are doing and in the way in which that work subjectivizes them. So, you have people who have university degrees, are in very corporatized environments. You have people who are who are working in small business environments, who are independent contractors, who are doing gig work. The types of work that people do, there's a greater level of difference. And it's harder to generate solidaristic bonds across the cultural differences that these different kinds of work, different kinds of education and training generate. Additionally, there's less reason to organize through production because it's easier for management to respond by moving production abroad than used to be the case. And then also, it's easier for management to make labor-saving investments in technology than used to be the case. There's been this explosion of, for one, moving Lego kit factories to Asia, which reduces greatly the leverage of workers at the point of production. And then secondly, you've got the explosion of robots, and not just in the manufacturing sector, but now you go into a McDonald's and you can order your food at the kiosk, and you can go through the Walmart and you can go through self-checkout at the end. The number of employees that are needed to run services is declining. And then there's also new technology coming down the pipes that will put robot bodies, in your house or in businesses, and then have these robot bodies piloted by people who are living and working in Asia or Africa or Latin America, who don't even have to migrate to the United States and therefore don't have to be paid a wage premium to incentivize migration. So I think that in general, the leverage of producers is shrinking as production becomes very cheap and human labor becomes a more marginal part of the cost of production.
Why do they need to have any human being piloting these robot workers? It seems to me that
the machines are not good enough yet to actually do it all themselves, right? But the technology allows for the machine to potentially be piloted by somebody very far away. And if the technology allows for that, then it becomes possible to subject service workers who previously were to some degree isolated from competition from foreign labor forces because it was not cost effective to bring people in to do that work, or because the work had to be done in a very specific location in which there's only a certain amount of housing and there's a particular kind of character to the place that people don't want to change for various reasons. Those kinds of arguments potentially fall away if we get machines that allow workers abroad to pilot remotely from across the world.
Right. My kind of old school thought about automation is that it always contradicts itself ultimately, in that as you automate more and increase fixed capital costs, then you cut into profitability. That human labor is a source of profitability ultimately, and that the only way for the system to continue is, well, two things. One, for there to be periodic economic crises that are deep enough that they reset the economy basically, and allow for some sector to become profitable again in a significant way. And the other way is for new jobs that require human labor to emerge, whether they're in the service sector or somewhere else, so that you can have value produced in a capitalist system, and that if we had a fully automated capitalist society, we would have a society without profitability, and that would
be a contradiction in terms on some level, because capitalism involves employer-employee relations.
Right.
Yeah.
It involves human labor.
So technological development puts strain on capitalism as a system, and yet technological development is the outcome of capitalism, provided that measures are not taken to consistently drive wages down to the point at which technological development is never incentivized.
Right. But which it can't be. You can't drive wages down that low.
Though I think there was, to some degree, this was one of the significant implications of neoliberalism, of the creation of the global system of trade, is that it made it easier to employ workers abroad rather than make investments in higher quality technology. And so, for instance, insofar as it's possible to get robots doing work, it'll be much cheaper to have robots that are remotely piloted doing the work than it will be to have robots that can actually think well enough to do the work themselves. And if labor costs in Asia and Africa and Latin America are low enough, it then becomes economically feasible to put robots in people's homes that are remotely piloted. And in fact, you have a competitive advantage doing that versus actually building robots that can actually do the work themselves.
Yeah, but what you're talking about there is nonetheless still major, and it requires a major investment in fixed capital. It is a form of technological innovation and automation. The number of employees that you would have to run a factory with some robot workers that are piloted, and probably many that are not, is just, they're far fewer than the traditional factory system, and the factory system itself was a form of automation, reducing the need for human labor. So if you push the wages down so low that you can maintain profitability based on human labor and not be pushed to innovate, those workers just won't continue to work. I mean, that's not going to be a level of wage that could sustain a workforce ultimately. Because
but it might slow down considerably. You can slow down considerably the rate of technological development through reducing the incentive. You're not going to stop it completely, but you can reduce the incentive.
Right, but
and then oftentimes military competition becomes a way of triggering technological growth in cases where it slows down very much.
Right,
I mean, lack of social or commercial competition driving it.
Right. Yeah, I totally agree with that. I'm just saying that ultimately there's a limit to how low wages can be.
Of course.
And there is also a limit to how much human labor can be replaced, by machines. And so
within capitalism.
Within capitalism, yes. And basically it never balances out. It never works out perfectly. We have just the right amount of fixed capital, just the right amount of variable capital, and then the system runs smoothly. No, you always are facing unemployment. You're always facing profitability crises in various sectors. It's a mess. It's basically just a perpetual mess that we're stuck with. And to go back to the topic of the government shutdown, it's worth noting that both parties use the mess politically. They both rely upon the precarity that's generated from this system to maintain political power and legitimacy, and different ways at different times. And in this case, you can see that within the course of a year, both parties were willing to create situations where the mess was intensified for political purposes.
Well, and the mess, therefore, is anti-fragile. It's a mess from one point of view, but not a mess from another, because if you can use a mess to sustain a political order, and the political order can benefit from the mess in various ways, then in one sense, the mess is not a mess, but is something functional.
This is a weakness for socialists, I think, because ultimately socialists, we might benefit from the mess in certain ways at the beginning, maybe, but if we gain political power in any significant way, we will not benefit from the mess. The point of socialism is not to maintain the contradictions within a capitalist society, and can't be seen to be that way, and we can't organize on the same principles as the capitalist parties do. That's my maybe my idealism or my sentimentality.
The question is what can compete with this at the level of motivating people to act? Yeah, and the reason that the labor unions no longer compete is as a organizing principle is that it doesn't seem to be the case that participation in labor organizing will in many cases substantially improve the conditions for workers. That's why the labor union participation rates have dropped as a percentage of the total workforce. And it's why in cases where radicals do prevail in labor unions and extreme strategies are tried, this typically results in offshoring or automation, and within a relatively limited unit of time.
Well,
and that's why I said, that production is not
right.
necessarily
No.
politically where it's at these days.
Where would you put it then? Would you put it around like medicine, Medicare, and things like that as the place to organize around, or would you put it somewhere else? What do you think is what would motivate people to organize collectively?
I think we're kind of caught in between worlds. So I think that production is no longer adequate as a basis, but also the alternative, which is to organize people as consumers or customers of goods, that has not yet fully emerged as a viable alternative either. Though you can see gestures at it in language, to do with boycotting, but boycotting is done in a very disorganized way currently at this stage.
Mm-hmm.
But when people talk about things like tenant strikes, there's a kind of gesturing at the users of the good,
Mm-hmm.
the consumers of the good being the ones who organize on the basis of their consumption. And similarly, patients organizing as customers of healthcare or organizing as customers of the university system. These are things that are gestured at, I think, by those taking some level of inspiration from the New Left.
Mm-hmm.
But this hasn't quite worked out yet either, because we're still in a world where the labor force participation rate is rather too high to easily and effectively organize people on the basis of consumption. But it's never going to be high enough, again, to organize people on the basis of production.
Yeah, okay. I'm not so sure of that, but I can see the argument. I'm removing.
There's a kind of aborted New Left. The New Left move is both with us and not with us, because there was a reason to go New Left that is still there, but it was not actualized on the time scale that the New Left anticipated. So it's partially aborted, partially there. This is what I call middle capitalism, this kind of space where New Left arguments don't work, but also old Left arguments don't work either.
Right. Well, give me an example of an old Left argument that you think doesn't work anymore.
I think the kind of old Left arguments would be predicated on the idea that we've just got to organize the producers. So some old leftists say, well, the proletariat is now in Asia. If you were to look at Asia, there's a huge industrial proletariat in Asia. And this is the thing to organize, because this is where the production is occurring. And just because the production isn't occurring in the West and in Western states, the labor force participation rate isn't what some people might imagine it could be. You can just organize in Asia on more or less the same basis that people used to do a long time ago. The issue, of course, is that now, as opposed to 100 or 150 years ago, factories move very, very quickly from place to place, which means all producer states compete with each other for jobs. Mm-hmm. And it means that if you were to begin organizing very heavily, say within China, the effect of this would be to suck production to other developing states and to produce another round of that kind of behavior. It wouldn't be to produce the kind of situation that one might imagine went on in the beginning of the 20th century, where you had a large industrial proletariat concentrated in the richest and most developed states.
Mm-hmm.
No, it wouldn't look like that. A lot of kind of old leftism, I think at this point, takes on a kind of productivist slant. It kind of sounds a little bit like the physiocrats, with reference to agriculture. So there's kind of an argument that all real wealth comes from production, and devaluing of the kinds of work that people do that are about generating consumptive activity. So it tends to be devaluing advertising, media work. These things, of course, generate a lot of consumer activity and produce in that sense. but are not producing in the more concrete sense that people who are often operating in a more old left sort of paradigm
Mhm.
are stuck in?
Mhm. I would say that you really can't separate out the value producing work from the wealth producing work. Well, actually, you have to separate them out first. You have to say there's work that produces value. In other words, the kind of value that can be exchanged and turned into money in the market. And then there's the work that doesn't directly produce that value, but nonetheless directs wealth, the real stuff in the world. And you have to have both. That's, in other words, you have to have financial and productive capital. One can't operate without the other. Obviously, it's true to say that if there weren't commodities being produced by workers, there would be no financial sector, right? But it is equally true that the organization of the production of commodities takes place through financial capital, and it under conditions of capitalism, it really can't be otherwise. The degree to which there's financialization, or the degree to which the emphasis is on the productive sector, changes. And I think that we're seeing an attempt to change towards production now, not just by people like Trump, but across the board in both parties, which is what you're talking about. I think you mentioned earlier.
Yeah, there's a desire for a rebalancing because it's perceived that there's a problem due to an imbalanced relationship, too much consumption occurring in some places, not enough production, too much production occurring in other places, not enough consumption. The difficulty, of course, is that even if you were to get these factories to come back, they would come back in a heavily automated form. So they would not perform the social and political functions that they previously would have performed at during the time period where they previously would have been located in the Western consumer societies. So you can't simply bring the factories back and get the kind of effect from doing that you previously would have gotten. And for that reason, I think most of them know this. It doesn't take a whole lot of looking into industrial engineering to recognize that factories now, when they come back to Western states, typically employ an order of magnitude fewer people than they would have done for a similar level of production 50 or 60 years ago. So what's then the real purpose here? I think it's often to do with defense and with making sure that the defense sector is not depending on potential adversary states. And this is, I think, to do with a sense that the rise of China is imminent, is a security problem. That, I think, is very much in the minds of the people who are making these decisions on behalf of the state.
Right. I feel as though we have to ask, when we're talking about organizing workers, we have to ask the question, organizing them for what? It often enough, there's a big emphasis put on trying to bring workers together in political solidarity around particular projects, which in and of themselves won't sustain any kind of independent workers movement. And I think the emphasis on which sector, service sector, or in the factories, more productive sectors, and what region needs to be organized, ignores the question of organized for what. And so that's one of the reasons why I'm more interested in the campaign than any other political project right now, the Campaign for a Socialist Party, because part of the purpose of the Campaign for a Socialist Party would be to discover what the workers themselves are already organizing for, and also then to help shape a political project that would be organizing for the self-emancipation of the working class.
I think it shouldn't be so hard to figure out what the workers are organizing for. And the fact that it's hard indicates that they're not organizing in a very coordinated way. if the workers were organizing for something in particular that we could straightforwardly identify and then work with or be aligned with, you wouldn't have to like go and investigate to find out what it was.
Well, I think of it as more along the lines of not so much going to the workers to find out what they want, but shedding our own presuppositions by exposing ourselves to reality. That I don't think it is very difficult to see what workers are organizing for. They're organizing for their own personal security, their own community, the communal security. They're organizing for themselves, and they do it in a variety of ways that are often in contradiction with each other.
And therefore are very disorganized. A lot of what the workers are doing is quite disorganized.
Well, what they're doing, okay, it's disorganized on one level, but it's also a form of self-organization on the other. But
also, if you pay attention to the organized examples,
mm-hmm.
Then this occludes to some degree all of the not organized stuff that is less visible because it's not presenting in such a way that you'd recognize it as organization. So there's all sorts of stuff that people do on the internet that is treated as not reality. It's ineffective, and it often takes up a lot of people's time and energy, the stuff people do online. This is substantively what a lot of people are doing, but it doesn't look like organization, and it's not very effective most of the time. So there's all of this digital stuff that doesn't look like social organizing, but is how a lot of people spend a lot of their time and energy.
Mm-hmm. I just think that a lot of our frames for how we think about politically organizing is colored by our own interests and the kinds of blinders or theoretical cul-de-sacs that we place ourselves
That's also who we are. Like that, we're made by the thing. We're part of the thing. So the fact that we are drawn to particular things that then don't seem to strike other people as in touch with reality, I think that's the thing that is the common thing. The common thing is that everybody is drawn to something weird that other people say that's weird, that's not in touch with reality. But the reality is that people are drawn to weird things that aren't shared in common and strike one another as bizarre or nuts.
Well, okay, I think there are quite a lot of working class people and middle class people who are drawn to, let's say, the disclosure movement. You know what the disclosure movement? This is my secret, obsession that I am embarrassed about, the UFO disclosure movement. So you look at that. Let's say a lot of working class people. Let's just say a lot of working class people are interested in UFO disclosure. It may not be the case, but
some of them are. But a lot of people think it's weird to be obsessed with UFO disclosure.
Right. It is a weird thing.
And not just college-educated elites. A lot of regular people think it's kooky to be obsessed with that.
Right. But the question then becomes, what's behind it? Why? Why are people obsessed with UFO disclosure? And I think that there are two reasons why people become obsessed with UFO disclosure. One, they are dissatisfied with society as it is. They are wanting something beyond this society, and they look to the stars for some vision of that, right? There's that. And the other is people are dissatisfied with the level of power and the power to occlude that the state has taken for itself. Those are the two fundamental drivers behind the interest in UFO disclosure. And I think that if you look at those things in the abstract, you can see those two drivers in many, many different attempts at self-organization amongst working class people. But I'd also say that the most practical self-organizing doesn't take place on that level at all. It takes place on the level of simply working with your friends, people you know, to make sure you're employed, or that you get what you need, or that you have someone show up to take care of your kids when you have to work, or things like that. So there's a very practical level of self-organizing that takes place that would
Also
be
a lot of escapism. There's a lot of getting really involved with online fandoms, committed to different niche interests that are often to do with making consumer demands on corporations to provide content in line with preferences. There's a lot of that too.
Yeah, I don't know.
Organized activity, but
I just don't feel like that kind of activity is generally coming out of the working class. But maybe my inclination to say that's driven by a relative elites, educated people, the managerial class more, the PMCs, rather than working class people.
I see a lot of people, if you go to a retail store or who are fans of things, like really intense fans of things, or on their cars.
Well, I mean, there's the difference between going to a shop where you wish that you could purchase the latest album. I guess dates me. No one does this anymore. But the point is that where you wish you could find your favorite food item that they don't sell, and you try to get the purchaser to stock what you like. There's that, and then there's the opposite, which is you think things that are being made available to the public ought not to be. And I think that second thing is much more common as a real it's something that's organized, and that doesn't necessarily usually come out of the working class milieu.
I think a lot of working class people play video games, and the video game communities are really intense.
Well,
really intense.
Yeah, but okay.
You think working class people don't have PlayStations and Xboxes?
No, of course they do, but I don't think working class people are like. I think most gamers, working class or otherwise, like the things that they like and try to get it and enjoy it, and are not that concerned with the things that other people like. That
they organize to try to get the products that they like made. They try to get companies to make the things that they like. They organize boycotts of products that don't conform with what they like to try to get companies to make things they like instead.
I guess. I mean,
it's not effective in terms of accomplishing anything that you or I would consider to be important. But it's still where a lot of the organizing behavior is.
Gamers who get really mad because you've reduced the breast size of Laura Croft or somebody like that.
I mean, there's the culture war side of it, which is more visible to people who pay attention to politics. But then there's also just ordinary gamer complaints about features of games that would not strike us as having anything to do with politics, but just customer complaints about, the devs, they, released a game that wasn't really complete and it was full of bugs, and then they expect us to pay for or wait for patches or DLC. There's all sorts of ordinary customer complaints that become very important to people because so much of their life is coming home from work and playing video games, or coming home from work and watching movies or streaming. This is a huge part of people's lives, and it's where a lot of actual energy goes into
that. Someone says Doug is still blowing into his classic NES cartridges and muttering under his breath, "These bougie fucking PlayStation dweebs." Yeah, that's true.
Have you heard that the console wars have ended because Halo is no longer an Xbox exclusive?
No, but thank you for that information. I do know what Halo is, and I know what an Xbox is, and I know what the console wars were, or what they. But I was never, I'll say this about the gaming things. We had a Wii in my household, and it was used sporadically, though mostly for Mario Kart, but otherwise. Maybe an occasional game of tennis or something. But then the real intense gaming always took place on desktop computers. It was if you wanted to play for real through Steam.
I'm old enough. I like the PC. I get it.
Yeah.
One of the
things is that old school now? It's playing on the PC now. Old school gaming is.
Steam brought it back. It was in decline, and then Steam emerged and brought back PC gaming, and their PC has been in the mix ever since Steam launched, quite firmly in the mix. In the 2007-8 period, the PC was really on the ropes, but it's come back through the emergence of Steam and large numbers of indie games that are only available for PC.
Yeah, I mean, I remember playing, I don't know when Portal came out exactly, but my kids introduced me to Portal and the Stanley Parable and, a variety of these.
Yeah, the early Steam games.
Yeah.
On this point, though, one of the things that Catherine D writes about a lot is the way in which sometimes factions within gamer fandoms get political and become politicized by some experience within gaming. And sometimes political actors deliberately try to leverage elements of this. It is something that I think,
I mean, look,
has political implication to it.
I have an intuition about this.
Way, it's hard to follow.
I have an intuition about this. If organizing around SNAP benefits ultimately is a dead end, certainly organizing around what kind of features Steam games have is a political dead end.
Well, but for instance, Donald Trump, right? Donald Trump is, to a significant non-trivial degree, a product of 4chan internet meme people working very hard, providing a lot of free advertising throughout 2016. The 4chan people really felt that they had in some way made Donald Trump happen. Now, some of them did it as a joke, and some of them did it because they had real political commitment. And in some cases, the joke became real political commitment.
Yeah, I mean, listen, I published a book that was sort of about this, and actually my novel, Bash Revolution, also touches about this. So I published Kill All Normies, by Angela Nagel, and then when I was at Zero, and then Bash Revolution is about gaming culture and AI and all that kind of thing. And there's a big part of it which I lifted directly, from reality of these gamers who would go on 4chan and created these superstitious rituals around the numbers attached to their posts, and when they would get a certain, like if they rolled snake eyes or something on their post, they would feel that it had magical powers to change reality or something along those lines.
Yeah, and a lot of these people want to think that their memes actually bring things into being, that they can hyperstition stuff, and there is a certain amount of that. But of course, if you were to look at any particular segment or faction or instance of it, it would look like just a weird niche subculture. And I think that's how it is now. Everything that everybody's doing looks from outside like a weird niche subculture, unless it's something you've heard of or something that you yourself are part of. And then you'll go, well, of course, lots of people are doing that.
Right. Right. Oh, all right. Well, listen, I feel like I've got to wrap this up because I've got things that are pressing for my attention, but we should talk about Kafka and monkeys.
Yeah.
Next time. The story we were supposed to talk about is a report for an academy. There's a link to it in the description for this video. And I will just say that I feel very much like an ape who has been forced to become a human after having read Kafka. And we should think about how we're all like that ape. So take a look at it, and we'll talk about that next time. But I'll just say, if anyone wants to take up, play a game of online Portal with me or Portal 2 sometime, I'm down. I still enjoy that game.
It's a single player game.
No, Portal 2 is not.
Can you play Portal 2 multiplayer?
Yeah.
Really? Does anyone do that?
I did with my kids. I'm pretty damn sure I'm remembering correctly that Portal 2 is a game that its big innovation was two people could play it.
Maybe co-op. I don't know, online. Yeah. Was it online? Maybe it was.
But Portal, it had multiplayer, and I think it was competitive to who got through the mazes faster, but I don't recall exactly. It might have been cooperative. But yeah, no, that's the best game ever made, in my opinion. And I'm gonna leave it there. And we'll see you next week. Probably on Monday, not on Tuesday. Well, actually, no, we won't see you next week. I'm flying back to Portland on Monday.
Oh,
But,
okay.
but we'll see you on Mondays going forward as soon as we can. Thank you, everyone, for continuing to watch as we sporadically, release content, but it's going to be coming faster and more furious in the months to come. So we'll leave it there. And thanks, everybody.